Edward Ed Marsh stood at a departure gate in Manila, boarding pass in hand, and he couldn't make his feet walk toward the plane. He told me that part himself, more than once, like he still didn't quite believe it. My brother Neil had flown 8,000 miles to save me from the mistake everyone said I was making, marrying a woman half my age. Instead, he rebooked that flight 3 times. 6 weeks in, he still hadn't told his own kids why. The brother who warned me I'd regret my marriage was the one who couldn't remember how to leave. Before I get into it, if you're new here, hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more of these stories to tell, and you don't want to miss the next one. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's Neil's story, and I only got the whole shape of it later, in pieces. Some of it from him, and some of it from Delia, who saw more of it than either of us wanted to admit. Let me back up to where it actually started, which wasn't in the Philippines at all. It started in my kitchen in Terre Haute, about 2 years before any of this, the morning I found out my wife of 34 years had already hired a lawyer. Sharon didn't sit me down. She left a manila folder on the counter, next to the coffee maker, like it was a phone bill. I'd just retired from the hardware store 4 months before that. Sold Marsh & Sons to a chain that kept my name on the sign for exactly 1 year. Then took it down. I remember standing in my own kitchen holding paperwork with my wife's new lawyer's letterhead on it, and thinking, stupidly, that the coffee needed to be thrown out because it had gone cold while I was reading. There'd been a retirement party 6 weeks before that, at the Elks Lodge, with a sheet cake somebody had ordered too big and a banner that misspelled "Congratulations." Sharon gave a toast. She said all the right things about 34 years and how proud she was, and I remember thinking at the time that she seemed relieved more than proud, and I didn't let myself sit with that thought long enough to ask why. I know now she'd already made up her mind by then. I just didn't want to know it yet. The settlement took the better part of a year to sort out, lawyers on both sides, a house that had to be appraised twice because we couldn't agree on the first number. By the time it was done, I had roughly $140,000 to my name and a store that didn't belong to me anymore, and Sharon had a new address across town I never once visited. A neighbor told me before Sharon did that she'd been seeing her financial planner for the better part of a year. I want to be clear, I'm not proud of how I found out I was the last man in the county to know his own marriage was finished. It's not something you get over being embarrassed about. You just stop mentioning it. The year after that, I made coffee every morning for 2 people out of habit, then dumped half of it. I drove past the old store on my way to nowhere in particular, twice a week, like I still had a reason. I kept Sharon's chair at the kitchen table empty rather than pushing it in, which doesn't make any sense when I say it out loud now, but at the time it felt like moving. It would have been admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Neil called me most days. "You doing okay?" was about the whole conversation. I let it go to voicemail more than I answered it, which I understand now hurt him more than I meant it to. Julie came by on Sundays for a while, brought groceries I didn't need, stood in my kitchen looking at the dishes stacked in the sink like she was doing math on how bad off I actually was. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. I was a 66-year-old man reorganizing a toolbox that didn't need reorganizing because it was the one thing in the house that still made sense when I touched it. My son Mark called less often, mostly on holidays, mostly short conversations about the Bears or the weather in Chicago, and I understood that as its own kind of grief, the way some people handle a family falling apart by simply not looking at it too closely. I didn't blame him for it. I wasn't looking at it too closely myself. What actually got me on a plane the first time had nothing to do with any of that. My daughter Julie gave me one of those mail-in Den-Na kits for my birthday, halfway as a joke, because I'd spent 30 years telling customers my people were Indiana, far as I know. Turned out my great-grandmother came off a boat from Ilocos Sur before my grandfather was even born, a fact nobody in my family had bothered to mention in about 90 years. I found an old photograph of her in a shoebox, stern-faced woman in a plain dress, standing in front of a stone house I didn't recognize, a date scratched on the back in pencil, so faint I had to hold it up to the window to read it. Nobody in 3 generations had bothered to write her name on it, which struck me harder than it should have, an entire life reduced to a face nobody could put a name to anymore. I decided I'd go take a look at where she was from, not looking for anything. looking for an excuse to leave the state for 2 weeks. Before I ever bought a ticket, I spent a couple of weeks doing what I guess you'd call research, though it didn't feel like research at the time. It felt like staying up too late, looking at things I had no business looking at. I watched videos of the province, read forum posts written by other retired guys who'd moved out there, some of them sounding happy, and some of them sounding like men trying hard to convince themselves. I ran the numbers on my Social Security and what was left of the settlement money against what a modest place might cost to rent, and the math worked out better than anything I'd seen back home in years, which scared me almost as much as it relieved me. I read about the healthcare too. Worried it wouldn't hold up if something went wrong, and didn't have a good answer for that worry except to go see for myself. Vegan wasn't what I expected, which is a stupid thing to say since I hadn't expected anything specific. Old Spanish streets, cobblestone, horse carts still running tourists up and down for photographs, air that was cooler and drier than I'd been warned to expect. A cousin of a cousin ran a heritage tour out of a little office near the plaza, and that's where I met Rosario. Everybody called her Rosie. She wasn't part of the tour. She ran a weaving shop 2 doors down with her sister, and she came over because the tour guide had the wrong dates for a festival and she wanted to set the record straight. I didn't fall into anything. I want that understood, because everybody back home assumed I did. We talked for maybe 20 minutes that first day, mostly about her family's loom, which was older than the both of us combined. I flew home 2 weeks later like I'd planned. Then I called her, because I'd written her number on the back of a receipt, and couldn't stop thinking about the fact that she'd corrected the tour guide instead of just letting the mistake stand. It was 9 months of phone calls before I flew back. 9 months of her sending pictures of finished cloth, and me sending pictures of a driveway covered in snow, both of us laughing about how different our lives were. She asked me practical questions I wasn't used to being asked by a woman. What my finances actually looked like, whether I had debts I wasn't mentioning, whether my children knew we were talking at all. I found out later she'd been burned once before. Not romantically, but by a cousin who trusted a foreigner's family with money and lost most of it, and Rosie had made herself a promise after that never to be the one asking a man for anything. I didn't understand yet how much that promise would end up costing both of us. I didn't tell my kids how serious it had gotten until I already knew I wanted to marry her. That part was cowardice on my end, plain and simple. I was afraid of exactly what happened next. I told Julie first. She was quiet a good long while, and then asked practical questions. How old was Rosie? What did she do? Had I met her family? Fair questions. Then I told Neil, over the phone, because I didn't have the nerve to say it to his face. "You've known her a year," he said. "About that. I was married to Linda for 3 decades, he said, and I still didn't see it coming. What makes you think you'd see anything coming at all?" I didn't have an answer for that at the time. I do now, but it took me a long while to understand that Neil wasn't really talking about Rosie. He was talking about himself. He and his own wife, Linda, had split up around the same time as me and Sharon, though he never talked about it much, and I never asked, which I regret. He said some other things that night I won't repeat exactly, because they weren't kind, and I don't think he'd want them quoted back to him now. The gist of it was that he thought I was an old fool being taken for a ride, and that saying so was his job as my brother. "What do you actually know about her family?" he asked. "Her finances? Who's going to be asking you for what? 6 months in?" "I know plenty," I said, which wasn't entirely true. "You knew plenty about Sharon, too, that one landed exactly where he meant it to." We didn't talk for almost 2 weeks after that call. Julie ended up being the one going back and forth between us, relaying messages neither of us wanted to say directly, until Neil finally called me back and said, stiffly, that he still thought it was a mistake, but he wasn't going to stop talking to his own brother over it. I took that as close to an apology as I was going to get, and I let it be enough at the time. I wired the down payment on a small house outside the vegan tourist district before I told anybody the wedding date. That's the part I'm least proud of. I didn't want another family meeting where everybody got to vote on my life. I'd had 34 years of people knowing things about my marriage before I did. I wasn't doing that again. I packed for that trip the way I used to pack for hardware conventions, methodical, everything accounted for, except I threw in an old measuring tape from the store, almost without thinking about it, the kind with my thumbprint worn into the metal from 30 years of use. I don't know why I brought it. I told myself it was for the new house, in case anything needed fixing. Some part of me, I think, just didn't want to leave every last piece of my old life behind in a box. The wedding was small, at a chapel near Rosie's family home, with maybe 30 people there. Julie flew out and cried through half of it. The good kind of crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue Rosie's aunt kept handing her from an endless supply tucked into her sleeve. Neil didn't come. He told me over the phone he wasn't going to fly to the other side of the world to watch me throw my settlement money into a hole. I stood at that chapel with a rented barong that didn't quite fit right in the shoulders, sweating through it in about 10 minutes, and thought about how different this was from my first wedding, back in a Methodist church in Terre Haute with 400 guests and an open bar. Nobody here was drinking to celebrate a merger of two families with matching bank accounts. Rosie's mother had passed the year before, and her father sat in the front row in a wheelchair, watching his daughter marry a foreigner 24 years older than her with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between worry and resignation and something that might have been hope. When the priest asked if anyone objected, the only sound was a rooster somewhere outside the open windows. Afterward, at a small reception in Nora's backyard, Rosie's father pulled me aside, spoke slow, careful English, and told me that if I ever hurt his daughter, he'd find a way to make the trip to America himself, wheelchair or no wheelchair. I told him I understood, and I meant it, and something about the way he studied my face after I said it told me he believed me. Rosie and I settled into the rented house. She kept running the weaving shop with her sister Nora. I kept mostly to myself those first months, learning the town, learning which door creaked and which tap ran hot before cold, doing small hardware jobs around the house because it was the one language I still spoke fluently. I told myself things were simple. I told myself Neil would come around eventually, the way people do. The house itself was a modest thing just outside the old Heritage District, concrete block downstairs, wood upstairs, a tin roof that turned into a drum during the rainy season. Compared to the place I'd sold back in Terre Haute, it wasn't much to look at, and I caught myself doing that comparison more than once those first weeks, mentally pricing out what I'd given up against what I now had. But it was ours, paid for outright with money that used to just sit in an account, collecting interest and doing nothing for anybody. And there was something about that trade that started to feel less like a loss the longer I lived in it. I learned the neighborhood slow. Learned which sari store carried the brand of instant coffee I liked. Learned that the power flickered during storms but rarely went out for long. Learned to keep a battery lamp by the bed just in case. I learned Rosie's language in pieces, mostly food words and greetings, enough to be polite without embarrassing myself too badly, and she learned to slow down when she talked to her sister so I could follow along, which she never once complained about doing. None of it was the disaster Neil had been picturing over the phone. It was just a life, built out of smaller and stranger pieces than the one I'd had before. About 6 months into the marriage, Nora's workshop caught fire during a bad storm. An old wiring problem nobody had caught in time, sparked by a surge that took out half the block. I remember the phone ringing in the middle of the night and Rosie's voice going flat and careful the way people's voices go when they're trying not to fall apart on the phone. We got there before sunrise. The looms were gone, 3 generations of work reduced to charred frames and the smell of wet ash, and Nora just stood in the wreckage of her own shop, not crying, which somehow felt worse than if she had been. Rosie didn't ask me for a dime. She has a cousin, back a generation, who got badly burned, trusting a foreign fiancé's family with money, and Rosie has never in her life asked a man for anything she thought she could lose. I watched her the next few days trying to figure out how to rebuild on savings that clearly weren't going to stretch that far, refusing every time I brought the subject up, telling me it was a family matter and she'd handle it herself. I offered before she could refuse it properly. $6,000, wired straight to Nora to replace the looms in the roof. I didn't tell Neil. I didn't tell Julie. I told myself it wasn't anyone's business but ours. Nora cried when the transfer came through, which she hadn't done standing in the ashes. She hugged me hard enough to leave a mark and told me, in English good enough that I didn't need Rosie to translate, that she wouldn't forget it. The rebuild took the better part of 2 months. New wiring done properly this time by a licensed electrician Rosie insisted on hiring, even though it cost more. New looms ordered from a supplier up in Bangor. The roof patched before the next round of storms could do more damage. I remember feeling, for about a week, like the luckiest man in the province, useful in a way I hadn't felt since the store closed. I had no idea that same $6,000 was going to end up sitting in my brother's head like a splinter he couldn't work loose. What I forgot, genuinely forgot, not conveniently forgot, was that Sharon and I had once set up a shared account alert years back for the kids' college fund, and somehow in the mess of the divorce that alert had never gotten switched off my end. It was still tied to an old number of mine that forwarded, for reasons I still don't fully understand, to a text alert on Neil's phone from some settlement paperwork years back that never got fully unwound either. He didn't tell me right away that he'd seen it. He told me later, much later, that he sat with that number for 2 days before he did anything about it. $6,000, wired to a name he didn't recognize, out of an account he still half considered family property. I found out what he'd seen the same way I found out about most things that year. After the fact, and from someone else. Julie called me one evening, sounding tired, and said, "Dad, Uncle Neil booked a flight to the Philippines." "He didn't tell you?" "He hadn't told me. He hadn't told her the reason either, not the real one." I sat there in my kitchen. A different kitchen now. Tile floor, ceiling fan turning slow overhead. Holding my phone, and all I could think was that my brother, who hadn't flown further than Florida in 15 years, was already somewhere over the Pacific, coming to save me from a marriage he thought was robbing me blind, and he hadn't even had the decency to tell me he was coming. I called him twice before his flight, both times going straight to voicemail, which told me he wasn't answering on purpose. I texted him something short, just that I hoped he had a safe flight and I'd pick him up whenever he wanted to tell me his arrival time. He didn't respond to that either. I sat with my phone in my hand a long while that night, running through everything I might have done wrong, coming up with half a dozen possibilities and settling on none of them, because the real one hadn't crossed my mind at all. The bus from Manila took closer to 6 hours than the 5 I'd promised him over text, and by the time Neil walked through our gate, his shirt was stuck to his back, and his suitcase had one wheel dragging sideways on the pavement. He'd never flown further than Florida before this, and it showed in every part of him. The way he squinted against the light, the way he kept checking his phone for a signal that came and went, the way he flinched a little every time a motorbike passed close on the road. I hugged him. He let me. Stiffly, the way you let a stranger help you up after a fall. I'd forgotten how much a first arrival takes out of a person who isn't expecting it. The heat alone does something to a man used to Indiana winters, and Neil had landed into all of it at once. The humidity, the noise of the terminal, 6 hours on a bus with his knees jammed against the seat in front of him, arriving in a town he'd never heard of a year earlier to confront a marriage he'd already convinced himself was a mistake. He told me later the whole trip he kept rehearsing what he was going to say to Rosie the moment he saw her, and every version of it sounded harder and colder in his head than it ever would have come out of his mouth. In the end, he didn't say any of it. He just asked where the bathroom was, which tells you something about how those rehearsed speeches usually go once a person's actually standing in front of the thing they were angry about. Rosie came out to meet him with a plate of pancit she'd made that morning, and Neil looked at that plate like it might be evidence of something. He said, "Thank you," didn't touch it, and asked where the bathroom was. That was the whole first conversation. I told myself he was tired from the flight. I didn't yet know what he'd seen on his phone 2 days before he bought the ticket. He was polite in the specific way that's worse than rude. Clipped answers. A lot of looking around the house. Really looking at the wiring, at the roofline, at how much the rent probably cost. Like he was doing sums in his head he didn't want to say out loud. I caught him once running his thumb along the edge of a countertop, the way I used to check a shelf for level back at the store, except he was checking my life, not my carpentry. He asked me, that first evening, how much the house had cost, phrased casually enough that I almost answered before I caught what he was really doing. I told him it wasn't any of his business, more sharply than I meant to, and he just nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer and filed it away as evidence of something too. Rosie served dinner that night in near silence, picking up on the tension between us without understanding the cause of it, and I remember thinking that whatever this visit was going to become, it had already started badly enough that turning it around was going to take more than a good meal. I misread all of it. I thought it was just Neil being Neil, disapproving on principle, still sore about the wedding he skipped. I had no idea about the $6,000 sitting in his head like a splinter. He didn't want to eat in the house those first 2 mornings. He walked instead, down past the corner, and found a carinderia run by a widow named Delia Reyes, plastic chairs, a chalkboard menu, good, strong coffee. The first morning he just sat there with his coffee and didn't say much to anybody, watching the street the way a man watches something he doesn't trust yet. He went back a second morning without meaning to make it a habit. Delia told me later she'd noticed him right away. An American sitting alone, stiff-backed, ordering in a clipped voice like he was afraid of getting something wrong. She didn't push conversation on him. She just kept refilling his cup without being asked and let him sit as long as he wanted. By the third morning, Delia had his order ready before he sat down. Black coffee, no sugar, whatever the egg dish was that day. And Neil told me afterward that it rattled him more than it should have, being remembered like that by a stranger 3 days into a country he'd flown to with his guard all the way up. He'd lived alone in Terre Haute 2 years by then, and I don't think anybody outside of Julie's Sunday visits had bothered to remember his coffee order in all that time. It's a small thing, being remembered. It costs the person doing the remembering almost nothing, but it lands different on a man who's convinced himself nobody notices him one way or the other anymore. I found that out much later, too. At the time, all I saw was my brother disappearing every morning and coming back quiet. On the 4th day, he finally said it, standing in the kitchen while Rosie was at the shop. "Who's Nora Buggerin? Rosie's sister," I said. "Why? $6,000, he said. "Out of your account," to her. I felt my stomach drop the particular way it drops when you're caught doing something you never should have hidden in the first place. I had maybe 2 seconds to explain the fire, the wiring, the storm, Rosie refusing to ask me for it herself. And instead, "God help me," I said. "I don't know what you're talking about. It was a stupid lie. It didn't even buy me anything." Neil just looked at me for a long second, and something in his face closed like a door. "Right," he said. "Okay." He didn't push it further that day. That was almost worse. He just filed it away as proof of something, and I'd handed it to him myself. For the rest of that afternoon, he was somewhere else entirely, polite in a way that had gone from cold to something closer to formal, answering Rosie's questions about his flight and the weather back home like he was filling out a form. Rosie noticed the shift immediately and asked me quietly, once he'd gone up to bed, if everything was all right between the two of us. I told her it was fine. That was the 3rd lie I told inside of a week, and I was starting to lose count. I want to be honest about why I lied, because it wasn't really about Neil. It was about the fact that saying it out loud, I gave her family $6,000 and didn't tell anyone, sounded exactly like what everybody predicted I'd do. It sounded like proof they'd been right about me all along, an old fool with a checkbook and no sense. The truth was defensible. Fire, storm damage, a woman too proud to ask, me choosing to help anyway. But saying it out loud felt like confirming the joke at my own expense. So instead, I buried it deeper, which is about the worst thing you can do with a truth that's already trying to get out. Rosie noticed something had shifted between me and Neil, though she didn't know why, and she pulled back from him too, in her own quiet way. Stopped offering food he wasn't going to eat, answered his questions with exactly as many words as they required, and no more. She has her own kind of pride. She wasn't going to perform hospitality for a man who was clearly deciding, behind a closed face, that she was guilty of something. Julie called me that week, more curious than worried. "How's it going with Uncle Neil?" "Fine," I said, which was the 2nd lie I told that week, and easier than the first. Meanwhile, Neil kept walking to Delia's every morning. I found out from her, months later, that he started asking her questions in a roundabout way. How long she'd known Rosie and Nora, whether the weaving shop was doing all right, whether she'd heard anything about a fire. Delia, who doesn't suffer fools and doesn't gossip about her neighbors to a stranger she's known 5 days, told him if he had questions about the Buggerin sisters he should ask them himself. Then she refilled his coffee anyway, because that's just who she is. He didn't ask them himself. Not yet. Instead, he spent an afternoon walking the neighborhood on his own, the way I later found out, stopping at the little bakery near the corner, at the hardware stall 2 streets over where he apparently spent 20 minutes talking shop with the owner about pipe fittings, at the barangay hall where he asked a clerk, for reasons he never fully explained to me, about property records for the weaving shop. None of it turned up anything he could use, and he came home that evening quieter than usual, like a man who'd gone looking for a fight and hadn't found where to throw the first punch. What he did instead, on day 6, was quietly call the airline and push his return flight back a week. He told himself it was so he could get to the bottom of things before he left me alone with what he now believed was a family taking advantage of a lonely old man. He told me, much later, that some part of him knew even then that the delay had nothing to do with protecting me. It felt like relief, not duty, and he didn't understand why, and that scared him more than anything he suspected about Rosie. I didn't know about the extension until Julie mentioned it in a phone call a few days later. "Uncle Neil's staying longer? He didn't say why." And I remember standing in my kitchen with the fan turning overhead, feeling for the first time that my brother wasn't just visiting anymore. He was investigating. And because of one stupid, reflexive lie, I'd made myself look exactly as guilty as he already suspected. If you're finding yourself pulled into this one, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every one of them, and it helps me know what stories to tell next. By the end of that first week, Neil had settled into a routine that looked, from the outside, almost like he lived there. Mornings at Delia's, afternoons walking the same 3 or 4 streets, evenings quiet in the room we'd set up for him, door mostly closed. Rosie kept our house running around him without complaint, though I noticed she stopped setting a place for him at dinner and just left the food out instead, which was her way of saying she'd noticed the cold shoulder too and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Neil started showing up places he had no natural reason to be. I noticed him walking past the weaving shop twice in one afternoon, slow, the way a man walks past a house he's thinking about breaking into. Rosie noticed too. She didn't say anything to me about it for 2 days, which should have told me how serious it was getting, because Rosie doesn't sit on things unless she's protecting somebody from her own temper. On the 7th day, he walked into the shop while Nora was at the counter, and Rosie was in the back with a customer. He asked Nora, straight out, about a delivery receipt he'd apparently seen through the shop window. Her name on it, a dollar figure close enough to what he already knew, and asked what exactly my money had bought her. Nora didn't answer him. She's not the sister with the temper. That's Rosie. Nora just went and got Rosie, and Rosie came out from the back, still holding a bolt of unfinished cloth, and looked at my brother standing in her family's shop, accusing her sister of something without once asking a real question first. "You want to know what happened to your brother's money," she said. "You ask your brother directly, to his face, like a grown man. You don't come in here and look at my sister like she's some kind of thief." "I'm just trying to understand what's going on," Neil said. Then understand it from him, not from standing in my shop, pointing at receipts like a policeman. Neil didn't have a good answer for that. He left the shop without saying much else, and by the time I got home that evening, both women had gone quiet in the specific way that meant I was about to hear something I didn't want to hear. Rosie didn't yell at me. She just set my dinner down harder than usual and told me, in a voice that had gone completely flat, that my brother had accused her sister of theft in front of a customer, and that whatever explanation I owed him, I'd better give it before another day passed. I told him the truth that night, finally, all of it, sitting on the porch step because neither of us wanted to be inside a house with Rosie close enough to hear us arguing about her. The fire, the wiring, the storm. Rosie refusing outright to ask me for money, out of pride, out of a cousin's old scar from a scam I'd never even known about until she told me. Me deciding on my own to wire it to Nora directly because I didn't want to watch 2 women lose a business over $6,000 I happened to have. Neil sat with that a long time. I could see him turning it over, looking for the angle where it was still exactly what he'd assumed. He couldn't find one. What he found instead, I think, was worse for him. Proof that his suspicion had been about money, but underneath the money it had never really been about Rosie at all. "So she didn't even ask you," he said finally, like he was testing the sentence out loud to see if it still made sense the 10th time he said it. "No," I offered, twice, before she'd take it. "Why didn't you just tell me that from the start?" I didn't have a good answer ready, so I told him the true one, even though it embarrassed me to say it, because I knew exactly what you'd think, and I didn't want to hear it confirmed out loud. He laughed at that, short and without much humor in it, the same kind of laugh he'd give me later that same night for a different reason entirely. We sat quiet a while after that, listening to a dog barking somewhere down the street. The kind of silence that isn't empty so much as full of things neither man wants to say first. I thought about offering him something to drink and decided against it, worried that getting up would break whatever fragile thing was happening between us on that step. "I came here to prove something," he said eventually. "I don't even know what anymore. That I'd made a mistake. Maybe. Or maybe that if you could still make a life work at 68, it meant I'd failed at something you hadn't." That landed harder than anything else he'd said all week, and I understood, for the first time, that I hadn't been the only Marsh brother carrying around a private humiliation he didn't know how to put down. "You lied to me," he said finally. "Not about the money, about the lie itself. I know." "Why?" I told him the truth on that too. That admitting I'd sent money quietly to my new wife's family felt like handing him and Julie and Sharon's whole side of the county exactly the story they'd already written about me. An old fool, taken in. Even though it wasn't true, saying it out loud felt like losing an argument I hadn't actually lost. "You've always done that," Neil said. "Hidden the parts that might make you look bad, even when the truth was fine. You did it with Sharon, too, near the end, pretending everything was normal right up until it wasn't. He wasn't wrong, and I told him so." It was easier to admit with him than it would have been with anybody else. Maybe because we'd grown up under the same roof, watching our own father do exactly the same thing, keeping bad news to himself until it turned into worse news nobody could fix. Neil didn't say anything for a while. Then, quieter than I'd heard him all week, he said, "Linda left in March, 2 years ago next month." I knew that much, vaguely, that his marriage had ended around the same time as mine, that neither of us had ever really talked about it. "Kids call me on my birthday and Christmas," he went on. "That's about it now. I had a whole life built around being needed by people, Ed, and one day I looked up and nobody needed anything from me anymore." He laughed, short and without any real humor in it. "So I guess I came over here to be needed by you instead. Turns out I wasn't even right about that." I didn't have a clean response to that. I just sat with him on the step a while, which is maybe the first honest thing either of us had done since he landed. 2 days later, I was up on a stepladder fixing the stair rail outside. It had been wobbling for weeks, and I'd been putting off doing it properly, telling myself it was close enough to level. I was distracted, thinking about Neil, thinking about the lie, and I put my weight wrong on a rung that wasn't as steady as I'd told myself it was. I went down hard onto the concrete edge of the step, wrist first. It wasn't broken, the clinic told us later, just badly sprained, but bad enough that I couldn't use the hand for much of anything for 2 weeks. I remember the pain more than the fall itself, a hot, sick feeling that traveled all the way up into my shoulder, and Rosie's voice above me, steady, telling me not to try to sit up on my own. Rosie got me into the car and to the clinic inside 20 minutes, calm the whole way, asking the right questions at the front desk in a mix of English and Ilocano I couldn't follow half of. She filled out forms, argued gently with an orderly about Q order, and had a nurse looking at my wrist inside of 20 minutes, all without raising her voice once. Delia showed up at the house before we even got back, with food, like she'd heard through some channel faster than any phone call, and had it laid out on the table by the time we walked back through the door. My arm in a sling, Rosie's hand still on my good elbow, steadying me over the threshold. Neil just stood in the clinic waiting room, useless in a way he clearly wasn't used to being. He didn't know which counter to go to, didn't have the language, didn't have the standing to make a single decision on my behalf. At one point, a nurse asked him something in rapid Ilocano, assuming he was family who could answer for me, and he just stood there blinking until Rosie stepped in and handled it without missing a beat. He told me later that was the moment something in him actually cracked open. Watching 2 women he'd suspected of exploiting his brother instead run the whole emergency competently while he stood there worth nothing at all. He sat in a plastic chair against the wall for the better part of 2 hours, phone dead, nothing to do but watch Rosie manage doctors, forms, and a language he couldn't follow. And by his own account, he spent most of that time thinking not about me at all, but about how long it had been since anybody had needed him to do anything more complicated than sign for a package. After that, he started fixing things around the house himself. Small jobs, gutters, a loose hinge, work he was actually good at from 30 years at the post office maintenance shed. He replaced a section of screen door that had been letting in mosquitoes since before Neil ever arrived, and fixed a dripping tap in the kitchen I'd been meaning to get to for months, using tools out of my old toolbox with a kind of ease that told me he'd been good with his hands longer than I'd ever bothered to notice. He sat with Delia most evenings instead of just mornings. I'd see them out on the plastic chairs after the shop closed, talking about nothing in particular. Delia telling him stories about her late husband. Neil telling her, apparently, more about Terre Haute than he'd told me in years. Julie called him at one point, confused about why he still hadn't come home, and he didn't have an honest answer ready for her yet. So he gave her something vague about making sure everything here was solid before hanging up quicker than he needed to. About 10 days in, I heard him ask Delia, careful and roundabout, whether she knew of any room going for rent longer term nearby. Just while Ed's wrist heals up, in case he needs a hand, Delia, who doesn't miss much, just looked at him a beat too long before she answered, and I think that was the moment even Neil understood he wasn't asking that question for my sake anymore. She told him, eventually, about a small room above a neighbor's garage, 2 streets over, cheap, clean, nothing fancy, the kind of place a man could stay a while without committing to much of anything. Neil went and looked at it that same afternoon, came back saying it might do if things went longer than planned, which was as close as he'd come yet to admitting out loud that he was thinking past his rebooked flight. I didn't say anything about it at the time. I just watched him fold a mental note away somewhere and figured he'd tell me when he was ready, the same way I'd have wanted the room to breathe if our positions were reversed. My wrist was healing, slow but steady, and Neil still hadn't booked a flight home. I finally said it to him straight, out on that same porch step, because I was tired of watching him pretend this was still about me. "You're not staying for me," I said. "You never were," he didn't argue. That's how I knew it was true. He sat there a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and said the divorce had taken more out of him than he'd ever let anyone see. Not just Linda leaving, but the quiet after, the house too big for one man, the phone that mostly stayed silent. Coming after me, he said, had been the last job he had left to do. Some brother to save, some use for himself. "You know what the worst part was?" he said, not really asking. Nobody even fought about the divorce. No arguments, no big blow-up, nothing to hold on to and be angry about. Just 2 people signing papers in a lawyer's office and going their separate ways like we were closing out a joint account. I kept waiting for it to hurt the way it's supposed to hurt, and instead it just sort of quietly stopped. And that scared me worse than any fight would have. I didn't have much to say back to that, so I just let him sit with it a while, which felt like the first honest silence either of us had shared since he landed. "And now?" I asked, genuinely curious what he'd say, since I hadn't heard him give himself an honest answer to that question the entire 6 weeks he'd been sitting on my porch. "Now I don't know what I'm doing here," he said. "Except I know I don't want to leave yet." He wasn't performing loyalty anymore, and it showed in what he actually did with his days. He went back for a follow-up on nothing more than habit, and ended up spending an hour at Nora's shop afterward, helping her get a jammed loom part working again with a screwdriver and more patience than I'd seen out of him in years. Nora told me later she'd expected him to hover and give advice nobody asked for, the way some Americans do, but instead he just watched her work for a while, asked good questions about how the mechanism was supposed to move, and fixed the one part that was actually broken without touching anything else. He was at Delia's every morning, not because he had nowhere else to be, but because he'd started to. Some evenings he'd walk down to the seawall a few blocks over and just sit there a while by himself, watching the tricycles go by, and I never asked him what he thought about out there, because I figured a man's entitled to some thoughts he doesn't have to hand over on request. Rosie mentioned once that she'd seen him out there talking quietly on the phone, low voice, longer than his usual calls to Julie, and I wondered for a while if there was a woman back in Terre Haute he hadn't mentioned. But it turned out he was talking to a realtor about listing his house, which told me something about how far along his thinking had already gotten before he ever said a word to me about it. I asked him once, half joking, if he was thinking about becoming a regular. He didn't laugh the way I expected him to. He just said he hadn't had a regular place to be anywhere in about 2 years, and left it right there at that, and I didn't push, because I recognized the tone. It was the same tone I used to use about the store, back before I understood what I'd actually lost when it closed. Julie called to say she was thinking of booking a flight herself, just to see what's actually going on over there, half worried, half curious. Neil took that call instead of me, out on the porch, and I heard him tell her the truth for the first time since any of this started. The bank alert, the lie I'd told him, the $6,000, the fire, how wrong he'd been about all of it, how none of it had really been about Rosie in the first place. It was the first honest accounting either of us had given anyone back home. I heard bits of it through the screen door. "No, Julie, listen. It wasn't what I thought. I was wrong about pretty much all of it." A pause, then quieter. "I don't know why I'm still here either. I just know I'm not ready to leave yet." Another pause, longer this time. "No, everybody's fine, better than fine, actually. I'm the one who's been the problem this whole trip, if you want the truth of it. Julie didn't end up booking that flight." She told me afterward, on a call of her own, that hearing her uncle admit he'd been wrong about something out loud was rarer than seeing snow in July, and that alone had done more to put her mind at ease than any explanation I could have given her myself. She said she might still come visit sometime, just to see it for herself, not out of worry this time, but out of plain curiosity about a place that had apparently changed her uncle more in 6 weeks than 2 years of therapy back home ever had, though she said that last part with a laugh, and I let it land as the joke she meant it to be. Rosie and I sat down not long after that and did what we probably should have done from the start. Put a real number on paper, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen between us instead of a phone screen and a bank alert nobody had asked to see. A fixed monthly amount toward Nora's shop repayment, small enough that it didn't strain us, agreed on by both of us instead of decided by me alone in secret. We wrote it on the back of an old receipt, the same kind I'd once used to write down Rosie's phone number, which felt like it meant something even though neither of us said so out loud. It didn't erase what the fire had cost her family, and it didn't magically restore what my divorce settlement had already spent. We were still watching every peso the way anybody living on a pension has to, still choosing between fixing the fence and fixing the water heater some months. But it meant nobody in that house was hiding numbers from anyone else anymore, including from each other, and that turned out to matter more to how we slept at night than any amount of money would have. Neil finally did book a flight home, 3 weeks later than his original ticket, and this time he told me himself instead of me hearing it secondhand. He had a house to close up properly, a postal pension to sort through, actual logistics waiting for him in Terre Haute that couldn't be avoided forever. He'd been putting off calls to his own lawyer and a property manager for weeks, letting mail pile up in a box back home while he sat on a plastic chair drinking coffee 8,000 miles away, and eventually even a man running from an empty house has to go back and deal with what's actually in it. But he booked a return date, too, for 4 months out, and said it without me having to ask. He told Delia first, actually, before he told me, which I only found out about because she mentioned it in passing while refilling my coffee one morning, like it was the most natural thing in the world that my brother would tell a woman running a carinderia his travel plans before he told his own family. The morning before he left, we fixed that stair rail together. The two of us, him holding the level steady while I drove the last screw home with my good hand. He checked it 3 times before he was satisfied, tapping the bubble against the light like it mattered more than it did, and I let him, because I understood by then that it wasn't really about the rail. Neither one of us said much while we worked. It was the first time since our father died that we'd built anything side by side without one of us needing to prove something to the other. Rosie made a proper meal that last night, more food than the 3 of us could reasonably eat, and Neil actually finished his plate this time, second helpings and all, no comment about evidence or anything else. Nora and Delia both came by, uninvited, which told me something about how far things had actually shifted since that first frosty plate of pancit Neil wouldn't touch. Nobody made speeches. We just sat around a table too small for 5 people, plates too full, and let the evening run long the way evenings do when nobody's in a hurry for it to end. At one point Delia asked Neil, in front of everybody, when he was actually planning to come back, not the polite kind of asking people do to be nice, but the kind that expects a real answer. He told her 4 months, same as he'd told me, and she just nodded like she'd file that away and hold him to it. Nora made him promise to fix the other jammed loom before he left, the one they hadn't gotten to yet, and he laughed and said he'd add it to a list that was apparently getting longer than he expected a 2-week visit to produce. At the airport, he stood at the gate with his boarding pass in hand, and for a second I watched him hesitate the exact way he must have hesitated 6 weeks earlier, except this time he wasn't frozen. He was just taking a last look before he turned and walked through. 4 months, I said, though some part of me already doubted it'd stay that way. 4 months, he said back, like he was confirming a delivery date rather than a flight. Then he added, quieter, might be sooner, depending how the house sale goes. I didn't ask him to clarify what he meant by that, because some part of me already understood, and I wanted to let him say it in his own time, rather than making him explain himself standing at a security line with people pushing past us both. He told me afterward, on the phone from Manila, that he'd come here certain he was the one saving me from a mistake. He left understanding he'd never had anything to save me from at all. What he'd actually needed saving from was a life back home that had quietly stopped needing him, and he'd found that out by accident, standing in a stranger's town, watching his brother's wife handle an emergency better than he ever could have. He said it plainly, without any of the defensiveness I'd gotten used to from him over the years, like a man reading off a fact he'd finally stopped arguing with. He called again a week later, from Terre Haute, sounding tired in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag. His house felt too big, he said, the way it had for 2 years before he ever bought that first ticket, except now he had something to measure it against. A small carinderia with plastic chairs, a woman who remembered his coffee order, a screen door he'd fixed with his own hands in a country he'd flown to hating. He didn't say he regretted coming home. He just said it felt like the wrong-sized life now, like a house built for a family that had scattered and never bothered to shrink itself back down, and he wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about that. I gave him the old measuring tape from the store before he left, half as a joke, half not. He put it in his carry-on without a word. Last I heard, he still carries it, says it's good for checking a level, and for not much else, and leaves it at that. I think about that tape sometimes, how it sat in a drawer in my old house for 2 years doing nothing useful, how it made a trip across the world in my luggage for no reason I could fully explain at the time, how it ended up in my brother's hands instead of mine in the end. Some things find their use in ways you don't plan for. I'd spent 30 years measuring boards and shelves and door frames down to a 1/16 of an inch, getting everything level because that's what the job demanded. And it took a divorce, a fire, a lie, and a sprained wrist to teach me that the things worth getting level in a life aren't always the things you can hold a tool up against. Rosie asked me once, not long after Neil left, if I thought he'd actually come back in 4 months, or if I thought he was just saying it to make the goodbye easier. I told her I honestly didn't know. But that for the first time in longer than I could remember, my brother had told me something, and I'd believed him completely, which was worth more to me than any guarantee he could have made. She just nodded and went back to her weaving, the way she does when she's decided a conversation has said everything it needs to say. If this one hit you the way it hit me telling it, do me a favor and hit like before you go, and subscribe if you want to hear the rest of what happened out here. There's more where this came from.